and making this list. And I started really with those musicians that were meaningful to myself and to Kevin, people that we both really enjoyed. James Honeyman Scott, his story is here. He was a guitar player for the Pretenders. We went to see the Pretenders, I think, on our third date. And their music was always in heavy rotation in our home. And then Warren Zevon was also in heavy rotation. Warren is a singer-songwriter. Like Mark Bolan, he is mostly known for one song that he did, which was Werewolves of London. He came to dislike, I believe, that song because he wrote so many really wonderful pieces of music that people don't know so well. And he particularly wrote really beautiful love songs, beautiful, realistic love songs about the difficulty of two people loving each other and trying to make things work. So Crystal went on the list very quickly. And I spoke with her. She, at the time, was running a coffee shop with her daughter, Ariel, and living in Vermont. She's quite active. At one point, when I called her, she was on the US-Mexico border protesting immigration policy. When I most recently reached out to her to get photographs, she was at the climate summit in New York City. So she is quite the activist and just a really, really wonderful person. So I spoke with her about life with Warren, and it's one of those stories where knowing their life together kind of brought him down a few pegs. He was way up here, and he was a rather difficult person to live with. So let me read you just a little passage from Crystal. Let's see. Warren and Crystal shared an intense, once-in-a-lifetime sort of love, and it doesn't surprise Crystal that neither of them moved on into permanent relationships after they divorced. I think I moved on in my life in certain ways after the divorce, but I never had another relationship that would equal that kind of love, that love. I don't think it's necessarily healthy love. I got into other relationships that weren't healthy, and that's been part of my struggle. Warren and I led separate lives, and yet he would call me out of the blue. It was like I was still his wife. He would call me after every breakup. He referred to me as wifey, always. What happens to the grieving process in that kind of relationship, I wonder? The grief Crystal felt after Warren died cannot be discounted because of their divorce. If anything, there's a realization that she grieved twice, once for the loss of their marriage and then again upon his death. Yes, she says, after he died, I did go through a grieving process again. That was when I had to separate from him even more than previously, in a much more final way. It took much longer for me to get over missing his presence when he died and when we had separated. I never remarried. He never remarried. We both came close a couple times, but then we didn't. He remains for me and always will be the husband, the father of our child, the grandfather of our grandchildren. Crystal kept her promise and told Warren's story in the New York Times best-selling book, I'll Sleep When I'm Dead, The Dirty Life and Times of Warren Zevon. Through interviews with friends, musicians, family members, and even his girlfriends, Crystal pieced together the story of Warren's life, even the awful, ugly parts, as he requested she do. Much of the book is based on detailed journals that Warren kept for much of his life. He wrote about the minutiae of his day, including things like a new type of mustard he tried on a sandwich. But he also wrote about his relationships, his sexual exploits, and about his feelings of Crystal and their marriage. Reading his journals was hell, she says. There were parts where he said wonderful things about me and the kids, but there were also many difficult parts. And he had this microscopic handwriting. I had to get a large map reading magnifying glass to read them. I started trying to read them in my house, but then it became too hard. It was just too traumatic. I would get through the stuff about the sandwich or who called him to collect a bill, and then there would be these moments of brilliance or anger or narcissism or just really beautiful writing. And the subject matter was often challenging. So that was, I will move here. When he died, it was as though I had to go through it all over again. Reading those journals, there was a lot that I didn't know. It required more forgiveness then. I had new anger. People asked me what surprised me when I read the journals, and the truth is there wasn't much that surprised me. There weren't many things he did that surprised me. What upset me was the prevalence. Things were more deep-seated. It brought it all up again. I had to go through it again, and it felt like getting beat up again. It felt like him punching me in the face all over again. But when I was done, it was over. I would never have chosen to do it had he not asked me to. I wouldn't have. But now I'm so glad I did, because it was like Warren's one last confession, one last request for my forgiveness. It allowed me to know and to forgive everything. And now I just really miss him. I miss his voice on the phone, the chance meeting somewhere, or making plans to go out to lunch, or talking about what we'll give our daughter for her birthday. I think a lot about our conversations. There are things I only told him and never talked about with anyone else. What happens to those things? I think about other things too. What I think about most is that I'm not angry with him anymore. Even when I think about the awful stuff, I'm not angry. Really, what a gift to myself. Had I not read the journals and written the book, I don't think I could be this clear on how I feel. Throughout our lives, we suffer the losses of those taken from us and the loss of those we let go. We judge and hold grudges, or we choose to forgive and move on. But the finality of death takes away the choice of how to handle past grievances or bad decisions. Things we should have said but didn't, or things we did say but didn't really mean. They all leave a residue of regret when the other person isn't here to provide resolution. If we're very lucky, as Crystal feels that she was, we're given the opportunity to make peace, something that may not erase the grief, but at least offers solace to all of us who remain. So that is love. That is real love. When it comes to legacy, of the women that I interviewed, I think nearly all of them work on that legacy. None more so than Ingrid Croce. I write in the chapter about Ingrid that you really can't talk about Jim Croce's career without talking about Ingrid. They were a duo for many years. And then he kind of went on to become more famous. The managers really preferred just to have Jim as a solo artist. So she stayed back home and he went out and became that huge star. And they had many struggles and difficulties. Ingrid talks about the time that just before he left to go on what would become his last tour. So he had 3 #1 albums within a couple of years' time. And Time in a Bottle was, this huge hit. But just before he went out on that last tour, they were going to secondhand clothing stores and trying to get a few outfits for him to wear on the road because they had no money. Nothing was kind of coming through the managers to them. And after Jim passed away, Ingrid would spend 10 years in court fighting for what was rightfully hers and Jim's. And she is a force. In the book, this interview is the first time that we discuss the fact that Ingrid now has aphasia. So it's very difficult for her to speak. And she is such an energetic person, and being with her in her home and seeing how badly she wanted to tell me about Jim. It's an experience that I'll never forget. It took us, the better part of a day to go through the interview. We looked over journal entries and things that she had written in the time before, and then just after Jim's passing. Her husband, Jimmy Rock, it's her second husband. She did remarry, which most of them do not do, but Ingrid did. And he was there and he was lovely. People have asked about remarrying. Do these widows remarry? And most of them really do not. Fewer still have successful second marriages, but theirs is one. And Gretchen Parsons Carpenter, who I'll talk about shortly, her husband, Bob Carpenter, both Bob and Jimmy said very early on that they knew that this person was going to be a part of their marriage. They knew that the rock star was always going to be there. And in fact, Bob Carpenter said, "I'm Graham Parsons' biggest advocate." That's my role. That's part of my role as Gretchen's husband. And what a generous man. So, both really wonderful people, and it was lovely to be with Ingrid, but she has worked tirelessly to promote Jim's legacy and to make sure that, as she said, as long as I'm alive, people are going to know who Jim Croce was and they're going to know his music. It's easy to see Ingrid's continued conviction to Jim's memory and legacy, and just as easy to see Jimmy Rock's equal conviction to Ingrid and all that she values, including Jim's legacy. They are true partners in every sense. Of Ingrid, Jimmy tells me she always had an artistic vision, which she has pursued in different formats, either visual art and collage, songwriting, music, food. She's never been someone who would lie on the floor and cry. She may cry, but she does so while she's moving forward. It's just who she is. She has overcome so many obstacles in life just by doing, and she will continue. Before leaving their home, the three of us take in Ingrid's visual art and collage work in her studio, taking many pieces of loosely related items, photos, drawings, writing. She pieces them together into stunning works that are a visual representation of Ingrid's thoughtful energy. Ingrid is often shy about her artwork, though I tell her she shouldn't be, Jimmy says. She's not shy about anything else. But I understand. With so much of herself out in the world focused on others, this representation of her earliest desire to be an artist, this beautiful and deep self-expression, is something that she wants to hold close, just to herself. She's deserving of so much, but especially this moment of privacy. It's not possible to be in Ingrid Croce's presence and not feel her energy, her love for all three of the men in her life, and her dedication to life here today and the legacy of yesterday. To see it represented in visual art, to hear it in music, to feel it as she moves through her kitchen, still making sure this visitor feels not just welcomed, but at home. Though the words are few, she is, as Jimmy notes, fully present and accounted for. She is vibrant and animated. She is still dedicated to her singular purpose of taking those forward steps for her love, Jim Croce. It was very difficult for her to speak. And at one point I said, or I think Jimmy asked me, what do you most want to know from the women that you talk to? And I said, I really am interested. I love hearing about their life with their husband or partner. But I really want to know what it was like in those first weeks and months after the loss. And what I hope to learn are these grief stories. And she had been mostly silent all day. And then just out of nowhere, she said, I had a child to raise. I had to get up every day and make breakfast, lunch, and dinner for AJ. And he needed me. And that's what kept me going. And it was, yeah, a little surprising, but also very true. And her son, AJ, is a musician. He travels. He's been most recently playing a lot of Jim's music and on his tours. And there's a video out there, if you can find it, I suggest looking it up, where he talks about Ingrid's aphasia and the fact that she has a lot of difficulty speaking, but once he starts playing Jim's music, she sings along to that. Every word. It's really quite amazing. So I think I will read just a couple more passages on some of the themes, some of the things people often ask. So what did you learn from these women? What did you take away from this? And there are several things. One of the things that really surprised me early on was how young these women were. During much of this time that I was writing this, my own children were in their early 20s. And I thought about how these women were 22, 23 years old, dealing with men who were sometimes quite loving, but other times very ego-driven, having drug problems, just a lot of stuff to deal with. And I don't know how they did it when I think back on being that young and having so much to cope with. And so I have this additional respect for all of them for getting through that time. And then there are other kind of commonalities that we have. I write about Judy Van Zandt, who was married to Ronnie Van Zandt from Leonard Skinner. Judy and I met in New Orleans, and we drove up to the small town in Mississippi, Galesburg, Mississippi, which otherwise would barely be on the map, except that it is where the plane crashed that took Ronnie's life. And so we walked the field where the plane crashed. There's a very large monument that fans have erected, and relationships with fans is another whole aspect of this that we don't realize. And I came to this project as myself as a fan of music. I wanted to learn about these people because I loved all of these musicians, and I see how they're really, the lines have been blurred and crossed about what is appropriate for a fan to do. And now, certainly with social media, it's even more difficult. I interviewed Catherine Mayer, who lives in London. I was highly jet lagged when I met with her. We had landed a few hours before, and she was married to Andy Gill, who was in a punk band called Gang of Four. And unlike some of the other widows that I had interviewed, Andy and Catherine worked very hard to keep their lives separate. She was a quite well-known journalist, still is. She has been a foreign correspondent for The Guardian. She covered a lot of politics. She wrote a biography of Prince Charles before he was King Charles. And so she had her life with Andy, but also a very well and full life separate from him. And she was telling me during our interview that shortly after Andy passed away, he had been traveling in China on tour at the end of 2019, and in early 2020, he developed what they thought was pneumonia. It was treated as pneumonia, but he did not get better. And so she believes now that he most likely had COVID. And so a lot of kind of second guessing and guilt and regret around that. It's a very interesting and somewhat difficult story. Though Catherine is certainly full of hope. She's already written a book about grief. She writes, and she told me the story of how about 3 days after Andy passed away, a fan called on his cell phone, or someone called on his cell phone. She picked it up, and this person said, "I'm a huge fan of Andy's, and I'm not doing well. I'm wondering if you can help me." He said, "You're not doing well?" Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And that is, that's the kind of overreach there is from people who feel that they've had such a loss that, that they're kind of entitled to be a part of the grieving. And so it's been very interesting to hear those stories and to, again, see how well they handle, in most cases, how well they handle those situations. I want to read a little bit from Gretchen Parsons, and Gretchen Parsons' story with Graham Parsons is one of it has become rock music lore. I will not go in, you'll have to read the book, I'm not going to go into it too much. But it was, again, a very difficult story. Although Gretchen is now doing very well, and she's just lovely. And we met at her home, and her husband, as I mentioned, was part of our conversation. And again, someone who was very young, a husband in Graham, a husband who was gorgeous, very good looking, talented, wealthy. He came from a family that had citrus farms in Florida. He had been at Harvard, so very bright. Very early on, they became good friends with the Rolling Stones. They traveled to the south of France and lived with Keith Richards and Anita Pallenberg and all that was going on in kind of the mid-70s there. And again, she's 21, 22 years old. Soon after they returned, Graham became addicted to heroin. And so she was dealing with that. He also had a bit of an alcohol issue as well. And so she, in her early 20s is trying to make this work. She really wants to make this marriage work. She wants to try to save him. And it has not been an easy thing to do. So let me read you just a little bit about her story. As I come back to this idea of Gretchen making peace, of possibly having arrived at a place where she feels exonerated, perhaps even absolved, she is quick to correct me. I've said that I worried after we spoke and planned for this conversation. I've lost sleep thinking about it. I asked myself, why would I want to sit here with you and go over all of this again? I'm so tired of it. But yet, this is important. It's important that people know. I ask her why she hasn't written a book herself, why she hasn't taken the opportunity to set the record straight before now. Once again, I learn it's just not that easy. Gretchen understands from experience how futile it can be to try to tell her story, how fans will challenge her truth, the truth, rather than accept responsibility for her mistreatment all these years. With that, the woman who has been very composed for the past 2 hours begins to cry. I've never met these other women that you're writing about. Isn't that odd? I don't know why, but I've gone through this alone. I feel badly that I don't know the names and their stories. This work, telling our stories, is so important. I thought I'd cry over something else, some memory of Graham, but I'm crying over this, over the grief, and that I don't know these women who've also gone through so much as I have. I consider the experiences that I had with Kevin's illness and death and how I handled them. I know there were times when I was less than patient, when my anger over our situation made him feel responsible. Yet the only person judging me for that is myself. I've never faced judgment from family or friends. Had I faced that in the midst of my grief after feeling like a complete failure for not stopping a terminal illness from taking the life of my husband, I don't know that I could have gone on. So much of your life is cut out from under you. So much of grief is grasping for something that can prop you back up, even if just for a day. When that isn't there, when that gets pulled away, or worse, when people turn away, what is left to keep you moving forward? What strength it must have taken a young Gretchen just to keep going. It's a common thread among nearly all these women that they are not able to own the narrative around the life and death of these men that they just loved. Yet so many others feel they have some ownership of that narrative because they liked his music or knew his birth date or kept a poster of him on their bedroom wall. Gretchen looks at me intently, bringing me back from my thoughts. She puts her hands to her chest. I've been asked about writing a book before, she says, but no one is getting a book from me, not ever. With all this landscape that I've had to live on, the years that have passed, the lies that have been told over and over, I'm not going to spend my time cleaning up someone else's mess. I need to hold my truth sacred. It's mine, and I will decide who, if anyone, I ever share it with. So with that, I think I have read enough. I'm happy to keep reading. This has been a life-changing experience for me to seek out these women, to have them say yes and to spend time with me and tell and share their stories. Gretchen's story, as I mentioned, quite often the narrative is set by someone else. Graham had us kind of relationship with a manager, and that manager has kind of told his story for years, and Gretchen has just been set aside. And so this was her opportunity to come out and talk about what happened. And so I was mentioning to Lori earlier, the thing that has surprised me as I now am going to, as the book is out and I'm doing events, is this weight, the heavy weight that I feel for being responsible for someone else's story. I really didn't realize how much the adventures of meeting them and spending time with them and getting the stories and then crafting the stories when I get back home to my laptop, that's all been really wonderful. And this has been wonderful too, but with a different feeling, the responsibility of it's not just my story, it's theirs too. And for so long, they've been either told incorrectly or ignored. And so it's been a real honor to bring them to people. And I do want to say too, that the book is about loss and grief, but it's also really hopeful. I find it very hopeful. One of the reasons I selected this cover was because there is this light, there's a stage with someone missing, but there's the light there too. And they have all gone on to do really many wonderful things, foundations and other programs that they do in memory, and making sure the music is still out there, and just really working really hard. So yeah, I honor all of them, and I hope you enjoyed reading them.
Wow, thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Yeah, anyone have a question?
So the widow that I want to know about is Sonny Bono's widow, was Bush. She really just got pushed aside.
Yeah. There, I have, as I said, I have a list of
Is she on
others
the list?
too, and she's on that list.
Oh,
Yeah,
good.
yeah, what a story. And many of them have been kind of, if there are, for instance, previous marriage or children from an earlier marriage. Yeah. I have talked to women who were living in a mansion one day and homeless the next day. And then they're called out for selling, a piece of furniture or, something in order to just survive. Yeah, yeah, it's pretty amazing. Yes, you had a question also.
Yes, I do. First, I want to thank you for sharing about your losses, because in 4 years, I lost both my parents also and my husband and 3 dogs. So I know that other people go through it, but it's nice to hear from other people. And the widow I was wondering about is Olivia Harrison. Have you tried getting in touch with her?
I have, yes, and it's so as of the end of May, I am with my 3rd publisher, which is how publishing works these days. But I started out, meeting with these women and writing their stories with no publisher at all. If it became a book, fabulous, that would be wonderful. But it was my project to meet these women and kind of create this grief group of just, these mythical women, who had kind of led these lives. I thought they're just going to kind of become my group, and I want to tell their stories. And so I did that for a couple of years with no book deal at all. And then I was put in touch with the publisher at BMG. So BMG is a huge music company. They had just started a publishing arm for books about music, and they are the ones that picked up the book and were going to publish it. And because they manage the estates of many of the musicians, it was the perfect place to be. So they did reach out to Olivia, and she, I don't know that she declined. I think we probably never heard back from her.
Because on interviews, she just seems like such a lovely person.
Yes.
And it really surprised me that she said that she asked him what he wanted his legacy to be. And he said, I want to be remembered as a gardener.
If you ever see pictures of their home and the gardens surrounding their home, they're quite amazing.
And he did it all.
Yes, he did. He did. Yeah.
That amazes me.
Yeah. It's been interesting to find out about the life off the road and what they were really like. Ronnie Van Zant, and what was Ronnie like? He wanted to fish. He wanted to get together with his high school friends. He wanted to go play baseball. He'd gather friends around after coming off of a world tour and opening for the Who or the Rolling Stones, or then their own world tour. He wanted to come back and play baseball with his friends and go visit his mom and dad. And so it really has been wonderful to get to know them in that other kind of light. So, and there are, I have a list of women who have said no, who have just declined, and quite often it is because of the trauma. It's just too difficult to revisit the story and to sit down and tell the story. And I sent I was sending letters to women in the beginning, and I sent a letter off to one woman who I won't say who, because she declined. I really wanted to interview her, and it's a fascinating story. And she wrote a letter back to me, and she said, I really wish you well with your project, but I was 18 when I met him, 19 when we married, 20 when I had our daughter, 21 when he divorced me and kicked me out, and 22 when I was responsible for burying. And I just will not go back there. So I, I honor that, of course. Yeah. So
Maybe you'll get more people. After they see what
I'm
you've written.
hoping, yes, yeah, that a few
People
will,
maybe just tonight or, you might.
yeah, yeah,
Right.
change their mind.
Have you had reaction from the people you did write about that you're presenting? Like,
Yes, most of them have been quite happy with what has been written. A few of them required that I send them, and so they could have kind of make some changes or right of refusal. And some of them were the most difficult stories. And so I first thought they're going to look at this and say, oh, I don't want this out there, or they're going to line through. And they didn't. They really do want the stories out there, and no one has asked them before.
that's wonderful, because
Yeah.
really, I don't know anything about these people and I don't know music.
Yes, yeah,
It's
yeah,
really,
yeah, thank you. And I'm sorry, you had a question?
I did. It sounds like you met with each person
I did,
individually,
Yeah.
which is just mind blowing that they didn't just say, oh, the phone or
Yeah,
whatever,
yeah, yeah.
that's something.
yeah.
So was it an entire day? Was it like, how did you took a conversation and then somehow made a story out of it?
Yes, yeah.
Wow.
And usually I would usually have at least 3 to 4 hours of interview. And then I would, I would rush back and download it to my laptop to make sure I had it and worry until I got that on there. And then I would have it transcribed, and then I'd go through the transcription and so much. I had questions that I wanted to make sure I asked everyone. I had one of the questions I had was, have you ever had signs? Have you ever seen or felt a presence? And almost all of them have.
Wow.
And so there were others questions as well, and most of them would be covered just in turning on the recorder and saying, tell me how you met. And then it would just go from there. It just flowed out of them. And it was really, pretty awesome to be in the presence of people who just wanted these stories to be told.
It sounds like you did them a service in a way.
I hope
Like
so.
kindness.
I hope they all feel that way. Yeah.
I think it'll make a lot of people feel differently, like other widows,
Yeah.
in that situation.
Yeah. Yeah, I will say one of the reasons that it took a while to get a publisher, and I tried the big five. I don't know if there are even 5 of them anymore, but we tried all of those publishers, and one of the things they would always come back with is we don't know where we would shelf it. Is it a grief book? Is it a self-help book? Is it a music book? A book can be more than one thing. Yeah, I think booksellers are smart enough to figure it out.
Yeah.
Yes.
The title, does that come as a quote from one of the women or?
It's a song. Yeah.
You have
So.
to sing it now.
It'll be in
I was-
your room.
we can all sing it.
Yes, we can all sing it, yes. I can't remember if I cried. It's actually the full 2 lines are here in the epigraph. I can't remember if I cried when I read about his widowed bride.
Yeah,
All right,
okay.
yeah.
And that line is about
Right.
Maria Elena Holly, Buddy Holly's widow, who I believe is the first rock widow. So, and she's plugging away down in Lubbock, Texas, still working on, preserving his legacy there. So, but she also, she didn't really decline. There are several who just kind of didn't say yes or no. So, yeah, I'd love to talk with her.
I was wondering about the kids, but then I thought, it's really not about them, you know what I mean? I was thinking, did you meet any of them or anything?
I did meet Melody Van Zant, when Judy and I we met in New Orleans, then we went up to, Gillsburg, where the monument is and the site. Her daughter was with her, Melody, and she really says that once Melody was born, Ronnie cleaned things up. Like that last tour that they were on, they had labeled it the torture tour because they were going to do it sober. And that was that was a result of Melody being born. And so yes, it was lovely to meet her. And then also killed in that crash were Steve Gaines and his sister Cassie Gaines, who was a backup singer. Steve was a guitar player who had just joined the band. And Judy and Steve's wife Teresa had been out that night, as you'll read, but they were very close and they remained very close until Teresa's passing just a few years ago. And there are other stories of there was a roadie for Leonard Skinner who quit just before this tour, didn't want to go out on tour with them again. And he ended up taking his own life because he felt so guilty about not being on that plane. So there's the fallout quite often, from these things goes farther and wider than we know. And it involves kids, it involves, all of these relationships and.
I have one more question. There is a widow that wrote a book. Did you happen to read Cynthia Lennon's book?
I did.
Called John, and there's I remembered because she's mentioning the children. Julian wrote a preface to that, which I thought was wonderful. He talked about how people say everyone loves his father, and he hated him in a way because he was such a horrible father.
Right.
I thought the honesty was wonderful.
Yeah. I think
Her honesty was wonderful.
Yes.
So she was a really wonderful woman.
And I think about too, again, I think having done these interviews and talked to all of these women, I think a little differently about someone like John Lennon, because he was also thrust into a situation that no one had ever been in before. At the age of 18, 19, suddenly, money and adulation as no one had seen before at that
And I
time.
just saw Nowhere Boy the other day. My grandson had me watch it. Have you seen that?
No.
He had a horrible childhood.
Yeah, he did. And so all of that, and in reading these stories, Scott Weiland is one of the more difficult stories. And when you find the person that the widow knew, that their partner or wife knew, quite often it's so different than the person on stage. And how do they do that? And how do they not get pulled into everything that steers them in a difficult direction? And how do you deal with things like mental illness when you are home and things are steady and you can deal with that, but when you're on the road and you have influences and all of these things, it really is a difficult situation that they've been thrust into. And so I think now we're kind of seeing that those supports need to be in place for young people who become famous quickly, but I don't know that it's enough or that it will be too effective. But yeah, these the men were in impossible situations too, quite often, and very challenging situations, and how they dealt with it was not always very good. So, but I think I have a little more sympathy for those situations now.
Well, I want to thank you again, Lori. Thank you. Sharing your story and the stories of all of these women. And, from the bookstore side, I'm just thrilled that we're able to offer this to our customers. From a friendship side, I'm just really proud, because I know how hard you worked at this, and it's really fabulous. So I hope you all will tell your friends about this great book and people that because I think there's a lot of different readers for it.
Yeah.
I know the publisher said they don't know. We know where to shop it, and I think readers know how to read it. So, so thank you. Yeah, so thank you again, and so we'll have Lori at our information desk if you wanna come and have her sign a book for you. And thank you again for coming and supporting not only Lori, but our digital ones, so.
Thank you.
Lori, will it come out on audio?
I don't know.
He's
looking.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're with or someone else.
Yeah. Different houses, I find, yeah, I find up all the audio ones.